Black Maid shivered in the cold. A lonely billionaire said, "My child needs a mother." Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The wind that night moved through the streets of Boston like a blade of ice. Snow drifted across the sidewalks and gathered along the edges of quiet townhouses that stood tall and proud behind iron fences. Most people had already gone inside to warm living rooms and glowing fireplaces. But on the far corner of Ashford Avenue, a woman stood alone beneath a flickering street lamp. Naomi Carter wrapped her thin coat tighter around her shoulders, but the coat did little to stop the bitter cold that pushed through the fabric and settled into her bones. Her hands trembled as she held a small canvas bag close to her chest. Inside that bag were the only things she still owned: a spare shirt, a worn photograph of her grandmother, and a small notebook where she once wrote down the dreams she used to believe in. Snowflakes clung to her hair and melted slowly against her dark skin. Each breath she took rose in a pale cloud that vanished into the night air. Just 3 hours earlier, Naomi had been inside a luxury hotel downtown, quietly polishing marble floors with the rest of the cleaning crew. She had worked there for nearly 2 years without a single complaint. She arrived early, stayed late, and spoke kindly even when guests ignored her presence like she was part of the furniture. But that evening a manager accused her of taking something from a guest room. Naomi tried to explain that she had never even entered that room. Her voice stayed calm, her posture straight, but the manager had already made up his mind. 10 minutes later, security escorted her out through the service entrance while snow began to fall harder over the city. Now the cold pressed harder with every passing minute. Naomi shifted her weight from one foot to the other, trying to keep the feeling in her toes. Across the street stood a towering stone mansion surrounded by tall black gates and glowing lanterns. The house looked warm and silent, the kind of place where laughter might once have filled every hallway. Naomi did not know who lived there, and she had no reason to care. She only stepped closer to the gate because the tall stone wall blocked some of the wind. She stood there quietly, hoping to gather enough strength before deciding where she might sleep that night. What Naomi did not know was that behind one of the tall windows of that mansion, a man had just noticed her. Daniel Ashford, one of the wealthiest men in the state of Massachusetts, paused in the middle of his long, empty hallway and stared out into the storm. His house was filled with expensive art and polished wood floors, yet it felt colder than the winter outside. When his eyes settled on the young woman standing beyond the gate, shivering beneath the lonely street lamp, something in his chest shifted in a way he had not felt in a very long time. Naomi Carter did not realize that someone inside the mansion had been watching her. She only knew that the wind had grown sharper and the snow was beginning to pile along the edge of the iron gate where she stood. Her fingers had become so numb that she could barely feel the strap of the canvas bag in her hand. She shifted her weight again, trying to keep the blood moving through her legs, but the cold felt heavier with every passing minute. Across the street, a pair of headlights slowly appeared through the falling snow. The large black sedan moved carefully down Ashford Avenue before turning through the open driveway of the mansion. Naomi instinctively stepped away from the gate, worried that the driver might think she was trespassing. The car rolled forward across the long stone driveway and stopped near the front entrance where warm golden light spilled across the snow-covered ground. A moment later, the driver stepped out and opened the rear door. Naomi could see a tall man emerge from the car. His dark coat fell neatly to his knees, and his posture carried the quiet confidence of someone used to command. Even from across the driveway, she could sense that this man belonged to the house. The man paused before walking toward the front steps. For a moment, he seemed to look directly toward the gate where Naomi stood. She quickly lowered her eyes and turned slightly away, hoping not to draw attention. People with homes like this did not usually want strangers standing near their property. Naomi prepared herself for the possibility that security might appear at any moment to tell her to leave. But something unexpected happened. The man did not go inside immediately. Instead, he remained standing in the falling snow as if he were studying the quiet street beyond the gate. Inside the warm mansion behind him, Another figure slowly approached one of the tall windows. A small boy pressed his hands against the glass and looked out into the winter night. Lucas Ashford had not spoken very much since the day his mother died. The house had grown quieter with every passing month, filled with soft footsteps and careful whispers from staff who no longer knew how to make the boy smile. Lucas often stood by the window late at night, staring out at the empty street as if he were searching for something that had disappeared. Tonight his eyes followed the falling snow until they settled on the figure standing beneath the street lamp. The woman outside looked so small against the storm. Lucas tilted his head slightly, watching her breath turn into pale clouds in the air. For a moment, he forgot the cartoons playing quietly on the television behind him. Outside the gate, Naomi rubbed her hands together and tried to gather the courage to keep moving. She knew she could not stand there forever. Somewhere across the city, there might be a church that kept its doors open at night or a train station where the heaters stayed on. But her legs felt heavy, and the snow continued to fall thicker around her boots. As she took a slow step away from the gate, a voice suddenly called out from across the driveway. It was calm and steady but strong enough to carry through the wind. Naomi froze and slowly turned her head. The tall man near the front steps was looking directly at her now. The light from the entrance lamps revealed his face more clearly. His expression was not angry or suspicious. Instead, it held a quiet seriousness that made Naomi pause. Daniel Ashford took a few steps closer to the gate. Snow gathered along the shoulders of his coat as he studied the woman standing alone beneath the street lamp. He had seen many things during his life as a businessman. He had studied contracts, markets, and the subtle signals people gave when they wanted something from him. But the woman standing in the cold did not look like someone asking for anything. She looked like someone who had simply run out of places to go. Behind the window, Lucas continued watching the scene unfold. His small fingers pressed gently against the glass while his eyes moved between his father and the stranger beyond the gate. A quiet curiosity stirred inside him that he had not felt in a very long time. Outside in the snow, Naomi waited, unsure whether the next words from the wealthy stranger would send her away into the storm or change the course of the night entirely. Naomi Carter hesitated as the man stepped closer to the gate. The snow continued falling around them, soft but relentless, turning the quiet street into a pale world of white and silver. Naomi felt a familiar tension rise inside her chest, the same guarded instinct she had learned over years of working jobs, where people rarely looked at her twice unless something had gone wrong. Wealthy neighborhoods had their own unspoken rules, and strangers who lingered too long near expensive homes were rarely welcome. Daniel Ashford stopped several feet from the tall iron gate and studied the woman standing beneath the street lamp. From this distance, he could see that her coat was far too thin for a Boston winter night. The wind lifted the loose edge of the fabric, revealing sleeves worn smooth from years of use. Her hands trembled slightly, even though she tried to hide it by holding the canvas bag tightly against her chest. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet street carried only the sound of snow brushing against stone and the distant hum of a passing car somewhere farther down the avenue. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice calm but direct. "Are you waiting for someone?" Naomi blinked once, surprised by the question. She shook her head slowly. "No, sir. I was just standing here for a minute. I did not mean to be near your gate. I can move along if you would like." Daniel watched her carefully as she spoke. Her voice carried a quiet politeness that did not sound forced. It sounded practiced, the kind of careful tone used by people who had spent many years working around strangers who held power over their jobs and their lives. He noticed that she did not ask for help and she did not try to explain her situation beyond what was necessary. She simply waited, ready to leave if asked. Behind the tall window inside the mansion, Lucas Ashford pressed his forehead gently against the cool glass. His eyes followed every movement outside. He watched the woman shift her weight from one foot to the other, watched the way she tried to hide the tremble in her hands. Something about her presence held his attention in a quiet way he could not explain. He had seen many visitors come to the house before. Business partners, lawyers, investors, and neighbors who spoke softly in the long dining room while adults discussed serious matters. But the woman outside the gate looked different from any of them. She looked tired and cold, yet she still stood with a kind of quiet dignity that made Lucas curious. Outside the gate, Naomi felt the wind grow stronger again. A sharp gust blew snow across the sidewalk and stung her cheeks. She tightened her grip on the bag and prepared to step away from the gate. "Thank you for letting me stand here a moment," she said gently. "I will not trouble you any longer." She turned slightly as if ready to leave, but Daniel spoke again before she could take another step. "Wait." Naomi paused and slowly looked back at him. Daniel rested one hand lightly against the cold iron bars of the gate. His eyes moved briefly toward the street lamp where snow gathered on the ground around her boots. The temperature tonight was well below freezing, the kind of cold that could make even a short walk dangerous without proper clothing. Daniel had spent most of his life making decisions quickly. Business had taught him to measure risk and opportunity in the same breath. Yet this moment did not feel like a business decision at all. It felt strangely personal, as if the quiet figure standing in the storm had appeared for a reason he could not yet understand. Inside the mansion, Lucas suddenly lifted one small hand from the window and pointed toward the gate. His voice, soft and uncertain from months of silence, slipped into the empty hallway behind him. "Dad." Daniel turned his head slightly when he heard the word. It had been a long time since Lucas had called for him without being asked a question first. Daniel glanced back toward the window and saw his son standing there, watching the woman with wide eyes filled with quiet curiosity. Then Daniel looked back at Naomi, still standing in the snow with patience and quiet strength. Something in his expression changed as he spoke again. "You look like you have been standing in this cold for far too long. The house behind me is warm. You can come inside for a while if you need a place to sit until the storm passes." Naomi Carter did not answer immediately. The invitation hung in the cold air between them while snow continued to fall quietly across the empty street. She had learned through long years of difficult work that kindness from strangers could sometimes come with conditions. Standing outside a mansion that looked larger than any building she had ever entered, Naomi felt the familiar instinct to refuse and move on before trouble found her again. Her fingers tightened around the strap of the canvas bag while she studied the man on the other side of the gate. Daniel Ashford did not move closer, and he did not open the gate right away. He simply waited with a calm patience that made the moment feel strangely quiet despite the wind moving around them. Naomi noticed that he was not smiling, and he was not looking at her with pity. His expression held something steadier than that, something thoughtful. Behind the tall window of the mansion, Lucas Ashford continued watching with intense curiosity. His small hands rested against the glass while his eyes followed the woman outside. He could see the way she hesitated and the way the snow clung to her coat. For a child who had spent many silent months inside the large empty house, the scene outside felt almost like a story unfolding slowly in front of him. Naomi finally spoke, her voice careful but respectful. "I do not want to cause any trouble for you or your home. I was only standing here because the wall blocked some of the wind." Daniel nodded once, as if he understood exactly what she meant. "You are not causing trouble," he replied calmly. "It is a harsh night to be outside for anyone." He glanced briefly toward the mansion behind him, then back at Naomi. The warmth inside those walls felt suddenly more noticeable when he thought about the bitter cold beyond the gate. Naomi looked down at the snow gathering around her boots. The temperature had dropped steadily through the evening, and the wind had begun to push thin streams of snow across the pavement like white ribbons. She knew that if she stayed outside too long, her body would eventually stop fighting the cold. Even so, she hesitated. Pride and caution often traveled together for people who had spent years surviving on their own. Inside the house, Lucas shifted his weight and pressed closer to the glass. The quiet invitation from his father had stirred something inside him. He watched Naomi closely, hoping she would say yes, even though he did not fully understand why. It had been many months since anyone new had entered the house. Most visitors came for business and left before dinner. The housekeeper spoke softly and moved quickly through the halls. No one stayed long enough to change the quiet atmosphere that had settled over the mansion since his mother passed away. Outside the gate, Daniel slowly reached toward the iron latch and opened the gate just enough for the hinges to move with a soft metallic sound. The warm light from the driveway lamps stretched across the snow toward Naomi like a narrow path. "You can sit in the kitchen for a while," he said in a steady voice. "There is hot tea and a warm place to rest until the storm slows down. You do not have to explain anything tonight." Naomi looked up at him again. The sincerity in his voice surprised her. Many people offered help with an impatient tone that suggested they expected something in return. But Daniel Ashford spoke as if the decision was entirely hers. The wind brushed another cold gust across the street, and Naomi felt it slide through her coat like a warning. She slowly stepped closer to the open gate, her boots leaving shallow prints in the fresh snow. "If it is truly not a problem for you," she said quietly, "I would appreciate a place to warm up for a little while." Daniel stepped aside to give her room to enter the driveway. As Naomi crossed through the gate, she glanced once more at the quiet street behind her, unaware that the moment she stepped inside those iron gates would soon change not only her own life, but the silent life of the child watching from the window above. Naomi Carter stepped slowly along the wide stone driveway, still holding her canvas bag close to her chest, as if it were the only thing grounding her in this unfamiliar place. The mansion rose before her like something out of another world, tall windows glowing with warm golden light that spilled gently across the snow. For a moment, she hesitated near the entrance steps, brushing a thin layer of snow from her coat sleeves. She had cleaned many large homes during her years of working different jobs, but this house carried a quiet stillness that felt different from the loud luxury she was used to seeing in wealthy places. Daniel Ashford opened the front door and stepped aside to allow her inside. The moment Naomi crossed the threshold, a wave of warmth wrapped around her shoulders and face. The air smelled faintly of cedar wood and fresh tea, a comforting scent that made the cold outside feel suddenly distant. Naomi paused just inside the doorway, her boots resting on a dark floor mat while she tried to let the warmth return to her hands. The entry hall stretched far into the house with polished wooden floors and tall ceilings that carried the soft echo of their footsteps. Naomi glanced around carefully, taking in the quiet beauty of the place without staring too long at anything. Years of working in other people's homes had taught her how to move respectfully through spaces that did not belong to her. Daniel closed the door behind them and brushed the snow from his coat before hanging it on a nearby rack. "You can leave your coat there if you would like," he said calmly. Naomi nodded and slowly removed the thin coat from her shoulders. The fabric felt stiff from the cold, and her fingers were still trembling slightly as she hung it on the hook. She rubbed her hands together gently, while Daniel led the way down a wide hallway toward the kitchen. The house remained unusually quiet for a place so large. Naomi noticed there were no voices, no television playing in the background, and no distant sounds of activity from other rooms. It felt less like a home and more like a carefully maintained museum where every object remained exactly where it belonged. As they reached the kitchen doorway, a faint movement caught Naomi's attention. She looked up and noticed a small figure standing near the far side of the room. Lucas Ashford stood partially hidden behind the kitchen island, his small hands resting against the edge of the counter as he watched the stranger who had entered his house. Naomi immediately slowed her steps, sensing the cautious curiosity in the child posture. Daniel noticed his son and gave him a small nod of acknowledgement. "Lucas," he said gently, "this is Naomi. She is coming inside to warm up for a little while." Lucas did not answer right away. His eyes moved quietly over Naomi's face, studying the snow-damp strands of hair near her temples and the tired kindness in her eyes. Naomi offered him a soft smile, the kind she often used when meeting children during cleaning jobs where families moved through busy homes full of noise and laughter. "Hello, Lucas," she said in a calm voice that carried no pressure. The boy blinked slowly, then stepped a little farther into the light of the kitchen. He still did not speak, but he did not look away either. Daniel moved toward the stove and filled the kettle with water. Soon the quiet kitchen filled with the gentle sound of the flame and the rising warmth of the burner. Naomi sat carefully at the edge of a wooden chair while she held her hands near the warmth of the kettle's steam once it began to rise. For the first time that night, she allowed her shoulders to relax slightly. Across the kitchen, Lucas continued watching her with quiet interest. He had seen many adults come and go in his home, but something about this woman's presence felt calm in a way that the house had not felt for a very long time. And without realizing it, the simple moment of warmth in that quiet kitchen had already begun to change something inside the lonely mansion. The kettle on the stove began to hum softly as the water grew hotter, filling the quiet kitchen with a gentle warmth that spread through the room like a calm breath after a long storm. Naomi Carter wrapped both hands around the ceramic mug Daniel Ashford had placed in front of her. Steam curled upward from the tea and touched her face, slowly thawing the cold that had settled deep in her skin. For a few moments she did not drink. She simply held the mug and let the warmth return to her fingers. Across the kitchen, Lucas Ashford stood near the end of the counter, watching her with careful curiosity. His small shoulders were slightly hunched inside a soft gray sweater, and his hair fell loosely across his forehead. Naomi noticed the way his eyes moved, studying every small movement she made, as if he were trying to understand who she was. Daniel leaned quietly against the edge of the counter while he poured tea into another cup. He noticed the silent exchange between his son and the stranger sitting at the table. Lucas had rarely shown interest in anyone new since his mother passed away. Most visitors barely received a glance before the boy retreated back into the quiet spaces of the house. But tonight Lucas remained where he was, observing Naomi with steady attention. Naomi finally lifted the mug and took a slow sip. The heat of the tea moved gently through her chest, and she let out a small breath she had not realized she was holding. "Thank you," she said softly while setting the mug back down. Daniel gave a small nod. "You are welcome. The storm outside will likely continue for a while. You can stay here until it settles down." Naomi nodded politely, but did not answer right away. Her eyes shifted toward Lucas again, and she offered him the same calm smile she had given him earlier. It was not the wide, cheerful smile people sometimes forced around children. It was quiet and sincere, the kind of smile that simply said she meant no harm. Lucas shifted his weight and slowly stepped closer to the table. His eyes moved from Naomi to the mug in her hands, and then back to her face again. Naomi noticed the hesitation in his posture and spoke gently, her voice calm and unhurried. "Your house is very beautiful, Lucas." The boy glanced around the kitchen as if seeing it for the first time through someone else's eyes. He did not speak, but his shoulders relaxed slightly. Naomi looked down at the table and noticed a small wooden puzzle resting near the edge of the counter. The pieces were scattered across the surface as if someone had been working on it earlier. She reached over slowly and turned one piece between her fingers before placing it carefully beside the others. "When I was younger, my grandmother loved puzzles like this," Naomi said quietly. "She used to say that every piece has its own place even when it takes time to find it." Lucas stepped closer until he stood beside the table. His small hand moved toward the puzzle pieces, but he hesitated before touching them. Naomi slid one piece toward him and nodded gently. "I think this one belongs over here," she said softly. Lucas studied the piece for a moment before placing it where she suggested. The piece fit perfectly into the wooden frame with a quiet click. For the first time that evening, a faint spark of interest appeared in the boy's eyes. Daniel watched the moment unfold from the counter with silent attention. It was such a small thing, barely noticeable to anyone who had not spent months observing the quiet distance Lucas kept from the world around him. But Daniel saw it clearly. His son had stepped forward without being asked and had joined the small activity at the table. Naomi did not rush the moment or fill the silence with unnecessary words. She simply placed another puzzle piece on the table and waited patiently. Outside, the snow continued to fall across the dark streets of Boston, but inside the warm kitchen something quiet and unexpected had begun to take shape, like the first small crack in a long winter of silence. Lucas Ashford kept his eyes on the puzzle pieces for a long moment after the small wooden click echoed across the kitchen table. Naomi Carter did not rush the silence. She simply rested her hands around the warm mug and allowed the quiet to settle naturally between them. The kettle had already been turned off, and the only sound in the room was the gentle ticking of a clock somewhere deeper in the house. Snow continued drifting past the tall kitchen windows, turning the dark night outside into a soft moving curtain of white. Lucas slowly reached for another puzzle piece. His fingers moved carefully across the table as if the simple action required courage he had not used in a long time. Naomi watched him with patient attention, but she did not lean forward or give instructions. She understood something important about children who had been through pain. They needed space more than guidance. The boy studied the piece in his hand and then looked at the wooden frame again. His brow furrowed slightly as he tried to find the right place. Naomi noticed the shape and quietly moved one nearby piece an inch to the side so he could see the empty space more clearly. Lucas looked at the opening again and placed the piece down slowly. It did not fit at first. He turned it once, then again, until finally it settled into place with another soft click. Naomi smiled gently. "That was a good one," she said in a calm voice. Lucas looked up at her. His eyes were dark and thoughtful, and for the first time, he seemed less guarded. His gaze shifted toward the mug of tea in her hands. "Is it warm?" he asked quietly. His voice was soft from lack of use, but the words were clear. Naomi felt a brief flicker of surprise, but she did not show it. She nodded slowly. "Yes, it is very warm. It helps when you have been outside in the cold for a long time." Lucas nodded as if he understood that feeling. Daniel Ashford straightened slightly from where he stood near the counter. Hearing his son speak without being asked a direct question had become rare over the past year. He watched the scene carefully, noticing how natural the exchange felt. Naomi did not look at Lucas with curiosity or concern the way many visitors did when they learned the boy spoke so little. She treated him as if his quiet voice was the most ordinary thing in the world. Lucas pulled out a chair and climbed onto it slowly. His small hands rested near the puzzle pieces again. Naomi slid another piece across the table, but she did not look directly at him when she spoke. "Sometimes puzzles are easier when you take a little break and then come back to them," she said softly. "My grandmother used to say that the pieces almost show you where they belong if you are patient." Lucas turned the piece she had, moved toward him. His lips pressed together thoughtfully. "Your grandmother sounds nice," he said. Naomi smiled faintly at the memory. She believed that kindness could fix many things in this world. Lucas placed the piece down beside the others and glanced toward his father for a moment before looking back at Naomi again. The kitchen felt warmer now, not just from the stove but from the quiet rhythm that had formed around the table. Daniel noticed it too. The heavy silence that had lived inside the mansion for months seemed to loosen slightly. Naomi finished her tea and set the mug down gently. Outside, the storm continued covering the city streets in fresh snow, but inside the large, quiet house a small conversation had begun where there had once been only silence. Daniel watched his son place another puzzle piece into the frame, while Naomi waited patiently beside him. In that quiet moment, he realized something he had not expected when he opened the gate earlier that night. The stranger who had stepped out of the storm had brought with her something the house had been missing for a very long time. Not noise or excitement, but something far rarer. A simple calm that made the lonely mansion feel a little more like a home. Lucas Ashford kept his attention on the puzzle for several quiet minutes after he spoke about Naomi's grandmother. The soft click of each wooden piece sliding into place seemed louder in the otherwise silent kitchen. Naomi Carter did not hurry him or guide his hands. She simply remained beside him with calm patience, occasionally moving a piece closer when she noticed he was studying the wrong corner of the board. The warm light above the kitchen island cast a gentle glow across the table, making the colors of the puzzle appear brighter than they had before. Outside the window, the snowstorm had grown thicker, covering the driveway and the quiet street beyond the gate in a deep layer of white. Daniel Ashford stood quietly near the counter with his arms folded, watching the interaction between his son and the woman who had entered his house less than an hour earlier. What he was seeing unsettled him in a strange way. For many months, specialists had come through the doors of this mansion. Therapists, counselors, and child psychologists had all tried different approaches to help Lucas return to the lively boy he had been before losing his mother. Most of them spoke gently and asked careful questions, but Lucas rarely answered more than a few words before retreating into silence again. Yet tonight the child sat at the kitchen table beside a stranger, speaking quietly about puzzles and warm tea, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Naomi slowly placed another puzzle piece near the boy's hand. Lucas examined the shape and then lifted it toward the board. As he searched for the correct space, his gaze drifted toward the far wall, where a framed photograph rested on a narrow shelf. Naomi followed his eyes and saw the picture of a smiling woman standing beside Daniel with one hand resting on Lucas' small shoulder. The warmth in the photograph stood in sharp contrast to the quiet emptiness of the large house around them. Lucas stared at the picture for several seconds. His hand holding the puzzle piece grew still. Naomi noticed the shift immediately. She did not look directly at the photograph again. Instead, she kept her voice gentle and steady. "Your mother looks like she had a very kind smile," she said softly. Lucas lowered his eyes. For a moment it seemed as if he might retreat into silence again. The small room felt suddenly heavier as memories moved quietly through the air between them. Daniel straightened slightly across the kitchen, unsure whether the moment might bring back the grief his son struggled with each day. Lucas turned the puzzle piece slowly between his fingers. "She used to sing to me at night," he said in a quiet voice. Naomi did not interrupt him. She simply nodded once, letting him know she was listening. Lucas placed the piece down on the table without fitting it into the puzzle. "After she got sick, the house got very quiet," he continued. Naomi rested her hands gently on the table. "Sometimes when a house becomes too quiet, it is not because love is gone," she said carefully. "Sometimes it is because everyone inside the house is trying very hard to hold their feelings in one place." Lucas thought about her words for a moment. His eyes moved slowly back toward the puzzle board. Naomi reached out and gently slid the unfinished puzzle closer to him again. "My grandmother used to say that when a room feels too quiet, it helps to bring a little music back into it," she said softly. Lucas looked up at her with curiosity. "Music?" he asked. Naomi nodded. "Even a simple song can remind people that they are not alone." The boy considered this idea while Daniel watched silently from across the kitchen. After a moment, Lucas picked up the puzzle piece again and pressed it carefully into the board. The piece fit perfectly. The quiet click echoed across the warm kitchen. Naomi smiled gently while the boy studied the nearly completed puzzle. Outside, the snowstorm continued, covering the city in white silence. But inside the Ashford mansion, something fragile had begun to shift, as if the house itself were slowly remembering the sound of life returning. Lucas Ashford sat quietly at the kitchen table after the final puzzle piece clicked into place. The small wooden picture now showed a peaceful landscape of a lake surrounded by tall trees beneath a soft orange sunset. Lucas studied the finished puzzle with thoughtful eyes, as if the image held something deeper than the pieces themselves. Naomi Carter rested her hands gently on the edge of the table and allowed the silence to breathe. She understood that some moments did not need words. The warm kitchen light reflected softly against the polished wooden surface, while snow continued falling outside the tall windows. Daniel Ashford remained near the counter, watching his son with careful attention. He had seen Lucas complete puzzles before, but tonight felt different. The boy had not simply finished the puzzle. He had stayed present the entire time. He had spoken, and most surprising of all, he had done it with someone Daniel had met less than an hour earlier. Lucas slowly turned his head toward Naomi. "Do you know any songs?" he asked quietly. Naomi blinked once with gentle surprise, then nodded slowly. "Yes, I do know a few songs. My grandmother used to sing them when I was young." Lucas rested his chin lightly against his folded arms on the table. "My mother used to sing too," he said softly. Naomi noticed the way his voice lowered slightly when he spoke about her. She did not ask questions or push the conversation further. Instead, she spoke in the same calm tone she had used since entering the house. "Would you like to hear one of the songs my grandmother used to sing?" Lucas nodded once. Naomi drew a slow breath and began humming a quiet melody. The tune was simple and warm, the kind of song passed down through generations rather than written in any book. Her voice was soft and steady, moving gently through the kitchen like a small lantern of sound. The melody carried a comforting rhythm that filled the empty corners of the large room. Lucas listened without moving. His eyes slowly closed for a moment as the sound settled around him. Daniel felt something tighten quietly in his chest as he watched the scene unfold. The house had not heard singing in a very long time. Since his wife passed away, the rooms had remained almost painfully silent. Even music on the radio had begun to feel too heavy with memories. But Naomi's voice carried none of that heaviness. It was calm and warm, like a memory that did not hurt to hold. Lucas opened his eyes again when the melody ended. He looked at Naomi with a thoughtful expression. "That sounded like the song my mother used to sing when I had bad dreams," he said quietly. Naomi gave a small smile. "Many songs travel farther than we realize. Sometimes they find new voices along the way." Lucas looked down at the puzzle again and gently traced the edge of one of the pieces with his finger. Daniel stepped forward slowly from the counter. He rested one hand lightly against the back of the chair beside his son. Lucas glanced up at him, but did not pull away. Naomi noticed the moment, but pretended not to draw attention to it. She picked up her empty mug and stood from the chair. "Thank you for the tea," she said politely. "I should not stay too long. The storm may slow soon, and I can continue on my way." Daniel looked toward the window where the snow still fell thick across the dark street. Then he looked back at Naomi and his son sitting quietly at the table. Something inside him had shifted during the past hour. He could see it clearly now in the calm expression on Lucas' face. For the first time in many months, the boy did not look lost inside his own silence. Daniel studied Naomi for a moment before speaking in a thoughtful voice. "The storm is still strong tonight," he said slowly, "and my son has not spoken this much to anyone in a very long time." Lucas looked up again when he heard those words. Daniel met Naomi's eyes with quiet honesty. "You may have come here only to escape the cold for a little while, but it seems you have brought something much warmer into this house than you realize." Daniel Ashford's words remained hanging gently in the warm kitchen air after he finished speaking. Naomi Carter stood beside the table holding the empty mug in both hands, unsure how to respond. She had entered the mansion only to escape the winter storm outside. She had not expected to become part of a moment that seemed to carry such weight for the people who lived there. Lucas Ashford remained seated at the table with the completed puzzle in front of him. His fingers traced the smooth wooden edge while he quietly listened to the adults. For a long moment no one spoke. The house itself felt as if it were holding its breath. Naomi finally placed the mug down near the sink and turned back toward Daniel. "I am glad if my being here helped in some small way," she said softly. "Your son seems like a very thoughtful child." Lucas glanced up at her when she said that, his expression calm but attentive. Daniel studied Naomi carefully. He had spent most of his life judging people quickly in boardrooms and negotiations. He knew how to read confidence, ambition, and even deception within a few minutes of conversation. But Naomi's presence felt different from anything he had encountered in those professional worlds. There was a quiet steadiness about her that did not seek attention or approval. She simply existed with patience and kindness. Daniel walked slowly to the table and rested his hand gently on the back of Lucas' chair. Lucas looked up at his father without pulling away. Daniel spoke calmly. "Lucas has not spoken this much to anyone outside our small circle in nearly a year." Naomi lowered her eyes slightly, not out of discomfort, but from respect for the honesty in his voice. "Sometimes children only need someone to listen without asking too many questions," she replied gently. Daniel nodded slowly as if her words confirmed something he had begun to understand during the past hour. Outside the window, the snow continued, falling in thick, silent waves, covering the city streets and rooftops. The storm showed no sign of ending soon. Naomi glanced briefly toward the dark glass. The longer she stayed inside the warm house, the more distant the cold night felt, yet she knew she did not belong there permanently. She turned back toward Daniel. "I appreciate your kindness tonight. When the storm slows down, I will continue on my way." Daniel remained silent for a moment. His eyes moved toward Lucas again. The boy had picked up one of the puzzle pieces and was examining its smooth edges even though the puzzle was already complete. Lucas finally spoke in a quiet voice. "You could stay until morning," he said while still looking at the puzzle piece in his hand. Naomi blinked softly and looked at him with gentle surprise. Lucas lifted his eyes toward her. "It is warmer here than outside," he added in the same calm tone. Daniel felt a faint ache behind his ribs at the simple request. For months Lucas had rarely asked anyone to remain near him. The boy often preferred the quiet corners of the house where memories of his mother lingered without interruption. Yet now he was asking a stranger to stay. Naomi looked between the father and son. She could see the unspoken history resting in the silence between them. "I do not want to impose on your home," she said carefully. Daniel shook his head slightly. "You are not imposing," he replied. He paused before continuing in a thoughtful voice. "The truth is that this house has felt far too quiet for a very long time." Lucas looked down at the puzzle again and turned the small wooden piece slowly in his hand. Naomi noticed the tired shadows beneath the boy's eyes and understood how deeply the silence had affected him. She sat back down at the table so she would be closer to his level. "I can stay a little longer while the storm continues," she said gently. Lucas nodded once, satisfied with that answer. Daniel exhaled quietly, as if releasing a tension he had carried for months. In that moment, he realized something unexpected. The stranger who had walked through his gate seeking warmth had already begun to change the rhythm of his home. And the night was not yet over. Naomi Carter remained seated at the kitchen table, while Lucas Ashford quietly turned the small puzzle piece between his fingers. The warm light above the table softened the tired lines on Naomi's face and reflected gently in the boy's thoughtful eyes. Daniel Ashford stood a few steps away, watching both of them with a quiet attention he had not felt in a long time. Outside the tall kitchen windows, the storm continued to move across the city, snow falling steadily and covering the silent streets in a thick white blanket. The world beyond the mansion had grown distant and quiet. Inside the kitchen, the air felt warmer and somehow lighter. Lucas finally set the puzzle piece down and looked at Naomi again. "Will you sing the song one more time?" he asked softly. Naomi smiled gently at the request. "Of course," she answered in the same calm voice that had filled the room earlier. She rested her hands lightly on the edge of the table and began humming the familiar melody again. The song moved slowly through the kitchen, soft and steady like a quiet heartbeat. Lucas leaned back slightly in his chair while he listened. His shoulders relaxed, and the small tension that usually lived in his posture seemed to fade with each note. Daniel watched the scene with deep focus. For months he had searched for ways to help his son find peace again after the loss of his mother. Specialists had spoken about therapy and emotional exercises, but none of those efforts had reached Lucas the way this simple song seemed to do. When the melody ended, Lucas remained still for a moment. Then he looked up at Naomi with a calm expression. "My mother used to say that songs help people remember that love does not disappear," he said quietly. Naomi nodded slowly. "Your mother was very wise," she replied. Lucas lowered his eyes for a second before asking another question. "Do you have children?" he asked. Naomi paused briefly before answering. "No," she said softly. "I do not." Lucas studied her face for a moment, as if considering something important. Then he spoke in the same gentle voice. "You would probably be a good mother." Naomi felt a small warmth move through her chest at the unexpected comment. She did not answer right away. Instead, she offered the boy a kind smile. "That is very thoughtful of you to say, Lucas." Daniel looked at his son with quiet surprise. The boy's words carried a sincerity that made the moment feel even more meaningful. Lucas then turned toward his father. "Dad," he said slowly. Daniel stepped closer to the table. "Yes, Lucas." The boy glanced between Daniel and Naomi before speaking again. "The house feels different tonight." Daniel nodded once. "I noticed that too." Lucas rested his hands on the edge of the table. "It does not feel so empty anymore," he added. Naomi lowered her gaze slightly, understanding the weight behind the boy's words. She could feel how deeply the quiet had settled into the walls of this home. For a moment, none of them spoke. The soft ticking of the distant clock echoed gently through the hallway. Finally, Naomi stood from her chair. "I should check the window," she said quietly. "The snow looks very heavy tonight." She walked toward the large kitchen window and looked out across the driveway where the snow had already formed deep white drifts along the stone path. The storm showed no sign of ending soon. Daniel stepped beside her and followed her gaze out into the night. "Thank you for staying a little longer," he said in a low voice. Naomi nodded gently. "Your son asked me to stay." Daniel looked back toward the table where Lucas now rested his chin on his folded arms, watching them both. Something thoughtful moved across Daniel's expression as he considered the quiet change that had come over his home that night. Naomi turned from the window and returned toward the table. Lucas lifted his head again and looked at her with calm expectation. In that quiet moment, Naomi realized that she was no longer simply a stranger warming herself from the cold. Somehow she had become part of something far more important inside the Ashford home, even if she did not yet understand exactly what that meant. Naomi Carter returned to the table after looking out at the heavy snow and gently pulled the chair back into place. Lucas Ashford was still watching her with the quiet curiosity that had slowly grown throughout the evening. His small hands rested on the edge of the finished puzzle while the warm light above the table reflected softly in his eyes. Daniel Ashford stood nearby, silent for a moment as he studied the two of them. The scene felt simple on the surface, a stranger sharing tea in a kitchen during a winter storm. But Daniel knew the moment carried far more meaning than that. For nearly a year, this house had felt like a place where time moved slowly through empty rooms. Since the loss of his wife, the warmth that once filled the mansion had faded into quiet routines and careful conversations that never stayed long enough to lift the silence. Tonight was the first time he had seen something different. Lucas had spoken freely. He had asked questions. He had listened to a song and allowed himself to feel comfort again. Daniel stepped closer to the table and rested one hand lightly on the back of Lucas' chair. Lucas looked up at him. "Dad," he said quietly. "Yes, Lucas," Daniel answered. The boy hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Naomi could stay tomorrow too," he said in a thoughtful voice. Naomi blinked with gentle surprise, and Daniel allowed a faint smile to appear before he answered. We will see what tomorrow brings, he said calmly. Lucas nodded once and looked back at Naomi. Naomi could see the quiet hope in his eyes, and it stirred something deep in her heart. She had spent many years moving from job to job, cleaning rooms, and helping families who rarely noticed the people who kept their homes running smoothly. But this moment felt different. It felt personal in a way she had not experienced for a long time. Naomi sat down again so she could look Lucas directly in the eye. You know something, Lucas, she said gently. Your house feels very peaceful tonight. Lucas thought about that for a moment. It did not feel peaceful before, he admitted softly. Naomi nodded with understanding. Sometimes peace takes time to return to a place after sadness has lived there for a while. Lucas looked down at the puzzle again and slowly traced the edge of the wooden frame with his finger. Then he looked up once more. My mother used to say that homes need people who care about each other. Daniel listened quietly as the conversation unfolded. Naomi's voice carried the same calm warmth that had filled the kitchen all evening. Lucas suddenly turned toward his father again. Dad, he said with quiet certainty. Daniel leaned closer. Yes. Lucas took a slow breath and spoke the words that had been forming. In his mind, the house needs someone like Naomi. Daniel remained still for a moment. The words were simple, but their meaning echoed deeply through the quiet kitchen. Naomi lowered her eyes slightly, unsure how to respond. She had not expected to become part of such an important conversation inside a home she had entered only hours earlier. Daniel looked at his son, then at Naomi. His voice was calm but filled with quiet honesty when he finally spoke. Lucas has not spoken that clearly about his feelings since his mother passed away, he said slowly. Naomi listened without interrupting. Daniel continued. When you walked through that door tonight, you were only looking for warmth from the storm. But you gave something much greater to this house. Lucas looked up again with hopeful eyes. Daniel met Naomi's gaze and spoke words that carried the weight of everything he had been thinking since the evening began. My child needs someone who can bring that warmth back into his life. The kitchen grew silent again as the meaning of his words settled gently into the room. Outside, the snow continued to fall across the quiet city streets. But inside the Ashford mansion, something new had begun to take shape. And for the first time in a very long while, the lonely house no longer felt quite so empty. The kitchen remained quiet after Daniel Ashford finished speaking. His words settled gently into the room, carrying a meaning that none of them rushed to interrupt. Naomi Carter stood near the table with her hands resting lightly against the wooden surface. She had spent most of her life moving quietly through other people's homes, making sure everything stayed clean and orderly before leaving again without much notice. Yet in this moment, she felt something entirely different. She felt seen. Lucas Ashford looked between Naomi and his father with calm expectation, as if he believed the answer to the future of this house rested somewhere in the silence that followed. Naomi slowly took a breath. I did not come here expecting anything more than a warm place to sit for a little while, she said gently. But your son has a very kind heart. Daniel nodded once. He does. Lucas lowered his gaze slightly, though a faint smile appeared at the edge of his lips. Naomi continued speaking in a thoughtful voice. I know what. It feels like when a home becomes too quiet after someone important is gone. My grandmother used to say that love does not leave a house all at once. It waits patiently for someone to help it grow again. Lucas looked up at her again with hopeful eyes. Daniel studied Naomi's expression and realized she was not speaking out of obligation or politeness. She meant every word. The snow outside had begun to fall more softly now. The storm that had brought Naomi to the gate earlier that evening was slowly calming. Naomi glanced toward the window where the first faint light of early morning was beginning to touch the horizon beyond the snowy rooftops. The night had passed more quickly than any of them expected. Lucas slid down from his chair and walked around the table until he stood beside Naomi. He reached out and gently held her hand, not with desperation, but with quiet trust. Naomi looked down at him with warmth in her eyes. Daniel watched the moment carefully. Lucas had not reached for someone like that in a long time. Naomi knelt slightly so she could speak at Lucas' eye level. Your father and I will talk about what comes next, she said kindly. But I promise you something. Lucas waited for her to finish. I promise that the warmth you felt tonight will not disappear. Lucas nodded slowly, satisfied with her answer. Daniel stepped closer to them both. Naomi, he said calmly. This house has everything money can provide, yet it has been missing the one thing my son needs most. Naomi listened quietly. Daniel continued in a steady voice. Lucas does not need a replacement for his mother. No one could ever replace her. But he does need someone who understands kindness the way you do. Naomi looked at Lucas and then back at Daniel. Her voice remained soft but certain when she answered. I can help him find his voice again. That much I know. Lucas squeezed her hand gently. Daniel extended his hand toward Naomi with quiet respect. Then perhaps this storm brought you here for a reason, he said. Naomi took his hand and nodded once. The first sunlight of morning slowly filled the kitchen windows, turning the snow outside into a field of soft gold. The Ashford mansion, once heavy with silence, now carried the quiet sound of new beginnings. Naomi had arrived that night as a stranger seeking shelter from the cold, but as the morning light spread through the halls of the house, it was clear that she had become something far more important. She had reminded a lonely father and a grieving child what warmth felt like again. She did not change the entire world. She changed one home, one heart, and one quiet house that was finally ready to live again.